Okay, so I just shortly want to talk about solidarity, human values, and identity politics regarding the EU in a much broader context. I've decided I'm going to start all my slides presentations for the rest of my life with this image, which is the image of planet Earth. I don't think it's possible to talk about the EU, solidarity, human values, and identity politics outside of a planetary context. And I study these issues from a planetary politics perspective. That is a holistic understanding of the study of politics. What I want to do in my presentation is rely on 3 or 4 articles I've written over the past 10 years, bringing together some of the aspects. And I was fascinated to be invited, and thank you for doing so, into a network that combines 2 of my research interests. That is the study of differentiated integration. In 2008, I wrote a report for the Danish Parliament on the long-term consequences of the Danish opt-outs. In 2016, I wrote a report for the Danish Parliament on the consequences of the Brexit referendum and the question of crisis. So a couple of these chapters are on crisis, an EU crisis and planetary crisis. And I want to look at, firstly, solidarity, then human values, and then identity politics within this sort of dual context. In 2013, I wrote a piece about studying the EU and understanding the EU as a type of, let's say, a communion. And when I say communion, I don't mean this in the religious sense, I mean this in the literal sense of sharing, and the extent to which it is possible to theorize and think about the EU within a study or a context of understanding solidarity, both at the EU and planetary level, from at least 3 different perspectives. And this is, of course, a heuristic, a thinking device. One is the conventional. Let's say 99.9% of all political theory works from a communitarian understanding of interests and preferences. One is the less conventional, about 0.1% of political theory uses cosmopolitan approaches. And then my own particular interest, which is the middle ground in some respects between these, which comes out of critical social theory, which is cosmopolitical approaches. Cosmopolitical in the sense that they look to the cosmopolitan level for an understanding of ethics and of ethics of solidarity. Political in the sense that all politics is local. So they look to the communitarian understanding, the localist component of approaches to how you actually engage in actions together on solidarity. But cosmopolitics is also agonistic in the sense that there's no one solution here, and there never should be. That all politics is and should be a struggle between different political perspectives, and simply trying to come out with one essentialist reading of what constitutes solidarity, citizenship, membership, nationality, as communitarians do, is an ideological dark space. And to a certain extent, the same is true from a cosmopolitan perspective. So somewhere in between these 3 different perspectives, and I will illustrate this towards the end of my presentation with reference to a book that I co-edited with Hella on transnational solidarity. I want to talk about human values within this context of solidarity, the extent to which we understand solidarity to be let's say, we're all equal in terms of human rights. We're all equal in terms of politics, or we're all equal but contested in terms of cosmopolitical perspectives. And to do this, I'm going to rely on a chapter I wrote in a book which came out this year on theorizing the crises of the European Union. And I've got 2 texts here from, the first is from Bridge, the description of the Bridge network, which is the investigating interconnections between various crises the European Union is currently facing, including Brexit, Euro, refugee crisis, rule of law, and the far right. And the book itself did something similar, and it had various chapters from famous theoreticians on how to explain the crisis. And the general approach of most of these approaches is that the crises are a series of really bad luck events, and eventually they will be overcome by addressing them one by one. And actually, if you look at the most recent Eurobarometer data in the graph in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see how trust in the EU and the member states climbed in the 2000s with the Big Bang enlargements. declined after the global financial crisis, crashed after the sovereign debt crisis, started to recover before you had the refugee crisis, started to recover, and then you had the Brexit crisis, and now you have the sort of the crisis of trust in the EU, and there seems to be a recovery within the context of the pandemic here. So this is all good news. You know, we're on the way back to solidarity, and the EU represents human values in the greatest sense. Unfortunately, I think all these responses, these kind of individual bad luck stories of crisis are just spectacularly incorrect. So what I tend to do is I take a more planetary approach, in the sense that, drawing on the work of Stephen Gill, it's quite clear that we are at the beginnings of a planetary organic crisis, a crisis in which questions of economy, whether it's the pandemic, austerity, society, whether it's intergenerational shifts, demographics, or migration, ecology, conflict, and polity aren't separate issues. They are the same issue. And so in the next 5 slides, I'm just going to explore that slightly, if I may. The study of the economy, and in particular the global financial crisis followed by the European sovereign debt crisis, was and still is considered to be a bit of bad luck caused by over-enthusiastic deregulation in the previous 30 years. The neoliberal austerity which accompanied it, and of course will accompany the post-COVID response, accentuated slightly income inequalities and wealth inequality, but at the end of the day, market economics will overcome these. But this is completely untrue. Income inequality across the world, as the work of Thomas Piketty and others have illustrated, has accelerated since the 1980s and continues to do so, and has accelerated doubly so with the pandemic. Wealth inequality, which is spectacularly hard to measure because nobody really wants to tell you how wealthy they are, is double that of income inequality and is accelerating equally in a non-linear way. So at the roots of one of these clashes is the issue that human values in the area of the economy remains largely unaddressed and unrecognized as being one of the commonplace problems that we need to address if we're thinking about human values. The second one is society, as Miriam nicely introduced with her discussion of migration and climate-related migration. Questions of inclusion, intergenerational justice, and health justice have, like inequality and the economy, simply gotten worse since the 1980s. And that, again, has been accelerated by the pandemic. The question to which there is any genuine realization of this is highly questionable. And the great news of the 21st century is that human population rates will peak sometime in the middle to the second third of this century, and then we will see a decline in general levels of population across the planet as fertility rates themselves also decline. The extent to which this will bring new and interesting variations in inequality, over inclusion, intergenerational justice, and health is also related to the first challenge, the challenge of economics and human values. So both of these are interrelated. They are not separable. Again, as we've just seen introduced, the human economic consumption is a non-linear growth pattern, irrespective of population. So it's a function of capitalism. The pollution, in particular air pollution, is and remains the world's greatest killer. Despite the pandemic, the long-term consequences of local air pollution will be far more significant. We're in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, which means over the last 30 years, about 70% of all monitored vertebrate, that's spinal mammals, have gone extinct or declined significantly in species. And we're unlikely to see any charismatic species remain viable in the wild by the end of the century. Add to that the climate emergency and the recognition that this year climate models of the atmosphere have been remodeled because they were inaccurate and based on 20 to 30-year-old assumptions of science, that we anticipate a doubling in carbon dioxide proportions in the atmosphere will lead to hitting an average temperature of about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, We anticipate that to occur by the end of this century. Modeling news this week pointed out that we had probably already reached 1.5 degrees, and we would certainly 66% chance hit 1.5 global temperature average rate sometime in the next 5 years. So the Paris Accord is defunct, in effect. It's almost impossible to hit a 2% target, and a 3% target, a 3-degree target is much more likely. That is indeed catastrophic. And that is related to the previous two issues of society and the functioning of neoliberal economics over the past 40 years. The third of this is conflict. And you know, as we've already heard, conflict, ecology, society, and economy go together. The image, of course, is taken from the Crimean conflict, but the truth is that we've seen enhanced militarization occur in an accelerating sense over the past 20 to 30 years. And this has led to not between state conflict, but within state conflict, and a general increase in so-called ontological insecurity. That's a sense of insecurity or angst in a more general sense. And this again is related to the three previous factors. And then finally, related to the first panel, of course, we have seen this lead to the ability of ethno-nationalists and the far right, whether in parties, movements, or in government, and of course the picture is of Salvini, Le Pen, and Wilders, to invoke a fear of the unknown, to invoke a fear of the foreigner, to invoke a fear of the racial, of the women, of progressives, of the past, and of others. Initially, we thought this was due to a decline in trust, and certainly discussions in and around, for example, the illegal Brexit referendum, raised that sort of issue. And we've seen a rapid decline in civil liberties and human rights over the past 17 years, not specifically associated with the pandemic, but actually probably more so than anything else related to supposed fears of migration, supposed fears associated with association and with privacy, and then more importantly, the invocation and loss of privacy associated with the war on terror. The ability then of ethno-nationalists to invoke these types of fears will only accelerate throughout the rest of this century, unless we genuinely take a more planetary approach to understanding the interrelationship between these five aspects. In a chapter that came out this year on the external action of the European Union, I studied these 5 different areas using the normative power approach. It's an approach to understanding the EU and its relations to its citizens and to the abroad, using 5 different approaches. What's interesting, of course, is the extent to which it matches the types of identity politics we see today. And the genuine challenge, I think, for identity politics and human values is to understand that questions of equality, of sustainability, of resilience, of security and justice are the challenges. But in particular, what ethno-nationalist and far-right parties do is divert our attention away from this and invoke an alternative set of realities, and something that the decline of expert knowledge and the explosion of the internet with social media have made increasingly harder to address. So that we're more concerned about, you know, as in the case of Denmark, the teaching of gender and post-colonialism, as in the case of Sweden, where I'm sat right now, the right to speak out in Swedish universities. These are invoked by the far right and by ethno-nationalist parties and governments, instead of addressing the actual issues which we should be concerned of. In the book on transnational solidarity, I attempted to approach these questions using the 3 different approaches of communitarianism, cosmopolitanism, and cosmopolitical approaches, in particular looking at solidarities within Europe, across Europe, and without. And I think that a concluding point, and this is what I'll finish with on my final slide, is that there is a human level of solidarity that's taking place, and there is popular movements, and we should support them, but they are not the popular movements that are alleged in these panels and workshops. Ethno-nationalists would like to think that they invoke populism, when in fact what they invoke is anti-populism. These then are the populist movements of the last 30 years, and they're the only genuine source of democratic change across the planet. And we need to recognize this and understand that governments, the EU, the types of discussion we're having today miss the point of what is going on in the middle of this planetary organic crisis, whether it is, and I'll just identify the pictures for you, the fall of the Cold Wall and the Brandenburg Gates, whether it's the Orange Revolutions, whether it's Tahrir Square and the Arab uprisings, whether it's the World Social Forum, whether it's the Occupy movement, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's Me Too, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, or whether it's Fridays for Future. This is the future of genuine populism, not the pseudo anti-elitist far-right ethno-nationalism, which is the discussion in which I think we're being misled into thinking is essential for understanding and addressing the planetary organic crisis. Thank you very much.